It's a pleasure to come over here and join with you in the start of the CEC campaign in the West. I should mention at the beginning, I am not a member of the Citizens Electoral Council. I feel that I should always retain my intellectual independence, and the lecture I give you this afternoon I would willingly give to the Liberal Party or the Labor Party or the Democrats and the Greens, but I know full well that they'll never ask me. But that is a good point to start, because I think you should look at what I have to say very carefully and work out why it is that the things I discuss with you this afternoon are never discussed in the media, in the television or the newspapers, virtually never discussed in parliaments, in federal or state. And we have to look very carefully, as I show you at the beginning. We have to work out who is really in charge of the national economy, who is really planning for the future of Australia, who is thinking about national development. And these are the questions I ask. And I'm going to divide my paper before you. I'm sorry it's rather long because we've got a bit of ground to cover. The first part is the global aspects. The second part is Western Australia. And the third part is the nation and whether we're working effectively. So, global aspects. The first point for Australia to note is that there's a total of 3 billion people in Asia and the Middle East. It is a huge market. The markets are China, 1,200 million, India, 1,000 million, Japan, 125, and so on. All of those are prospective markets for Australia, and they're very close. And some of them are in 4 and 5 days sailing distance from that part of 4 or 5 days sailing from there is a market of almost 3 billion people. So we have to think about it very carefully. We live in the fastest growing decade in the history of the planet. And the important thing to note is that the population growth is in the less developed regions. The more developed regions, such as Australia, the population is declining. So in places like Australia, we are not really reproducing ourselves. And we're going to depend on immigration to maintain our present population. And that is rather critical. And it's this surge in population up here that is causing consternation to the Australian government on immigration and boat people and so on. There's an enormous pressure over there, and we effectively are not reproducing ourselves. That is enormously important in many ways. Now, so we get, and if there are certain parts of the jigsaw I want you to remember and just take away just as a little piece of a jigsaw. There's one. The world population is growing at the rate of 1 Western Australia every 9 days. Can you comprehend that? The world increases by a population equal to the total population of Western Australia every 9 days. So we have to be aware of the position of Western Australia, the resources of Western Australia, that sort of growth. And Western Australia has to think about planning and building Western Australia in a world that is, if you like, pressing on Western Australia, providing that sort of pressure. And I was in China a while ago. I was mentioning to some people, my son's, I've got 4 sons. One of my sons, who's a manufacturer, said to me, "Dad, what are you doing next week or so?" And I said, "Nothing much." He said, "Have you got your passport ready?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, I'll take you to China for Father's Day. And that was rather nice because it meant that he didn't have to take any of his staff and pay for them. and so here is Shanghai. I never saw more dramatic civil engineering in my life. It's absolutely fantastic what they're doing in Shanghai. But the important thing is I demonstrate that half the world's population are living in cities like that. Here's the Shanghai City Hall, and there it is the other side of the river. We had lunch in that restaurant, or that one up there, I'm not too sure which one it was, and it was all rather miraculous. And then, of course, there's the Maglev Train. And you go out to this airport, the most wonderful airport I've seen in my life, all this huge area, undercover, and you go to the other airports of the world and they have a series of buildings. They don't. They have one building and you can look for miles. And it's all this wonderful roof structure that extends quite a lot. And there's the Maglev Train coming in, and the freeway. And in Shanghai, you climb on board the Maglev Train. It travels at 400 kilometres per hour. Think about that. Chinese, 400 kilometres an hour. And you get to the airport. The interesting thing is it's German technology, and the Chinese entered into contracts with the Germans, and the Chinese put the infrastructure, the railway there. Then they agreed with the Germans that they would build all the trains were built in China, and they're ready to build maglev trains for anywhere in the world. If anybody around the world wants to have maglev trains, they'll be manufactured in China. And they're on top of the technology and moving rapidly. So that's the competition. And this is the sort of thing that we have to be aware of. The cities of the world are growing very rapidly, but in Australia, we have to think about the fact that by, say, the year 2015, which is only about 10 years or so hence, Jakarta will have a population of 21 million, which is the population of all of Australia. Just one city. And there's the others. Shanghai will be 23, and Tokyo 26. Now, there's a surge to the cities, and there's various reasons for it. One of them, of course, is increasing prosperity. Another is groundwater. The world's wells are drying up. And what has happened in the last 50 years is that groundwater was available for anybody that wanted to exploit it. This, of course, has happened in the Great Artesian Basin. I'm dead scared it's going to happen in the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, the important thing, and I'll show you about the Great Artesian Basin, is that the water is available free of charge. And the same could apply to other groundwater. But if you want surface waters, you've got to pay for it. And this is a problem. But the world's wells are drying up due to depletion rates greater than that. And the surge to the cities is amplified by that. India. And this is India in natural colour seen from space. I'm showing you a few of these pictures. This is the new way. You don't use maps anymore. You use real photographs in real colour taken from space. Look at this. Look at that. See the edge of the Himalaya just along there? And this, the Gangetic Plain and India. Now, groundwater in India was regarded as a democratic resource. It meant it was freely available for anybody who could drill a well and had access to a pump. And what happened is that they pumped the groundwater out, the wells are drying up, and the farmers and peasants are just walking off their land. Because the guy next door who's rich has the money pay for the pump, and he pumps the groundwater down, and the poor people can't do it. A lot of the wells, and I've seen them recently in Spain and in Morocco, are hand dug. And they take the well down to about 100 metres. Can you imagine hand digging a well without ventilation at 100 metres? They wind them down on the windlass, they have a few breaths, and they might drop dead. So it's very serious. People are dying and the whole issue is coming to a head. And this is the situation in India. All the villages have these groundwater wells. Very few of them have this recirculated water, pipelines, sort of thing. Groundwater is the normal thing. China. And the North China Plain up there is drying out. In 1996, the North China Plain had 3.6 million wells, almost all for irrigation. 99,000 were abandoned in 1997 and 220,000 new wells are drilled. It's a huge activity. The well drillers are chasing the water down as it falls 3 metres a year. So the groundwater is falling at 3 metres a year and they're drilling wells as fast as they can go. Very serious state of affairs. As the water tables fall, the springs dry up, streams cease to flow. Lakes disappear. A province in China once had 1,000 lakes, only 83 remain. So China is in dire problem regarding groundwater. This North China Plain, its present uses now exceed sustainable supply by that much, which is more than 5 times the annual irrigation use in the Murray-Darling Basin. So they're pumping the groundwater out faster than 5 times the amount we use in the Murray-Darling Basin. It won't last, and they all know. And so China is building some fairly massive other surface irrigation works elsewhere, and the people will inevitably leave this area. Now, this decline in groundwater is critically important in the Muslim countries. All of these countries through here. And they greatly depend on groundwater and all these Arab nations. And I was recently in Morocco, in the Berber country, and seeing the way they're using groundwater. And of course it's drying up and people are losing their lands, and when you're in Tangier here, you can see them queuing up, trying to get across to Europe. So there's a flood of people from these areas trying to get into green Europe. And green Europe, of course, is not reproducing itself. They're without water and reproducing themselves, and there's a great flood of people trying to get out of this area into Europe. It's understandable that Howard is panic-stricken about boat people, because we're lucky. We haven't got anywhere near the problems of Europe. And in the desert, the wells were dug many years ago, and there's a steady natural flow. And the trouble is that the wells start to dry up and they pump more, take more water out, and it just disappears. Now, other countries with serious water deficit include Yemen, Iran, Egypt, Mexico, Ghana, Morocco. Here we are. It's just building up. And so, in Australia, we have to think about the fact that there's over 1 billion people out there in the world that are losing their water resources rapidly. They have depended on groundwater, it's no longer available, and Australia's got rainfall and a few things, and they could come here. So we have to be aware of the enormous pressure on Australia to develop our resources and our food. So there you are. A friend of mine sent me this, and he said, look, I got some people that have just recently arrived in Australia, and they're driving around, they have their own transport. Could you put them up in your backyard for a week or so? Anyway, I couldn't. So there's a vast global water deficit. The world is increasing a vast water deficit in that we're using water which will never be available again, and we've got a rate of use which is quite unsustainable. And the deficit is invisible, unrecognised and unreported. Now, I've got a friend of mine, who's right, my views on this he's trying to report them. Now, this guy, he's 5 years older than me, and he rang me up and said, oh, look, can I run that story about you and the Great Artesian Basin thing, and he said, I'll try and put it in some of the London newspapers, the Independent or the Guardian or the New Statesman or something like that. And I said, okay. So he's written it up. And he's now trying to negotiate with these British firms to write the article that he prepared. I should mention that this chap, he was Chief of Staff and head of the Sun News Pictorial under Sir Keith Murdoch. And when Sir Keith Murdoch retired, he sold his house to him. He's a dear friend of Dame Elizabeth and so on. He's, if you like, well connected with the Murdoch family. And he's been a newspaper man for 50 or 60 years. And he's a nice chap. He's having the greatest difficulty in getting the story reported in the London papers because they can't believe it. In 1964, I took that picture, and that's my wife and 2 of my sons, on the Mekong River, where it flows out of Burma there, Laos over here, and China 1,000 kilometres up there. And at that point, we're well over 1,000 kilometres from the sea. We're up at the border with Burma and Laos and Thailand. And the river is flowing, as you can see, about 1.5 kilometres wide. It's about 500 metres above sea level. And I was there as an engineer, and I was looking at various dam sites and irrigation projects on the Mekong. And we were going great guns, and I was as happy as Larry doing some of the most important work I've done in my life. And then there was a parachute drop on one of the dam sites we were working on, and there were guys with machine guns walking around. And then a few people on the bank had pot shots at one of our drilling sheds in the river. And if you're sitting in a drilling shed in the river, you can't go very far if somebody starts firing at you from the bank, and you go, bang, and a ding, and it hits the shed. So I decided it wasn't a place for a robust young man like me and the family, and we went back. Now, it was 40 years ago, and the Mekong Project has been stationary ever since. And now some interesting things are happening. And I said, 40 years ago, I went to Southeast Asia as a UN advisor on dam design. And there's the Mekong River. It flows into the sea near Saigon, that used to be, and flows up there between Laos and Thailand through Cambodia. And then this is the place, the previous photograph is up there, you see. It's a long way away from the sea. And then the river continues way, way up there. And the implementation of the project required the collaboration of Thailand, Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam. And I was working with the countries, and in fact I went to Saigon in order to make a presentation on various engineering proposals that I had. And the project was stopped by the war, and little was done, and I returned to Australia. The other day I received a phone call from Washington, and it's all about resuming work on the Mekong Project, but now it's different. The Chinese and the Indian governments have advised the 4 riparian countries that the Chinese and the Indians are prepared to develop the project. They're prepared to design and build these dams, everyone. They'll design and build the dams, they'll provide all the engineering, do all the survey, do all the drilling and everything else. They'll fund it, get on with the job. And they have in mind the creation of a food bowl for China and India. So we have a situation where this project is hundreds of billions of dollars, and the Chinese and the Indians are saying to the Cambodians, the Thai and the Lao, don't you worry, don't you worry. You just leave it to us. We'll design and build your dams because we want that to be developed as a food bowl for China and India. And of course they'll have a railroad going straight into China, and the food bowl will be providing food for China. At no cost. Don't bother, don't worry a little bit. You get the idea? Get ready, Ernie. You're going to do the same up north. And so it is proving difficult for Thailand and Laos and Cambodia to resist the apparently generous proposal. They haven't got the engineers and experts and whatever. The Chinese will bring them in by the hundreds. Australia. we could get similar generous proposals. Are we organised and ready? Everyone? Right. Okay. Now, we have to be ready for the growth in the global economy. Because of the advances in education, improved communications, the growth and freedom of world trade, tyranny improved, there's remarkably steady growth of the world. Now, I do a fair bit of work in looking at economic development in non-monetary terms. For about 20 or 30 and 40 years, I have used other measures of economic growth because I have found that the economists repeatedly have it wrong because they get hooked up on dollar values, currency exchange rate, interest rates, you name it, and you can't work out what's happening in a country. But if I work with things like kilowatt hours, a kilowatt hour is the same in any country. A kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour. A kilowatt hour runs the same lights in all countries of the world. A kilowatt hour drives the same factories. And so if we look at the world in terms of kilowatt hours, we smooth out the bumps. And there it is. Now this shows the world growth in electricity production, just plotted on an arithmetic scale for, I've got 29 years of data. So there's 29 years of data of the world growth in electricity production, and it's a dead straight line for 29 years. Year after year, just keeps on going. And it means that people are investing and they're building new generating plants and so on. That growth. Now, once again, in Australia, we have to have a comprehension of the magnitude of the growth of the world in industrial terms, and this chart enables us to do it. For comparison, the annual growth in the world corresponds to an increase equal to the entire present production of Australia every 7 months. So in other words, if you think of all the electricity supply in Perth, and all the lights and all the factories, all the generating plant and the transmission lines and all throughout Western Australia, and then add to that South Australia, and then add to that Victoria, and all the generating plant and transmission lines and the Snowy Mountains and the hydro in Tasmania, and you add New South Wales and Queensland, and add it all up, that growth in the world is at such a rate that they can provide all of Australia's needs for electricity every 7 months. It's a huge growth in world industrial capacity, and that is another factor we have to take into account. And now there are differences occurring, and this is economic growth in terms of total electricity generation. What's been happening is that the Americans have been stimulating the service sector of their economy, and now they're starting to drop. And my latest data is that they're coming down very rapidly. Europe is continuing to increase, but here's the interesting thing. China is flattening off, Japan is flattening off, and China's growing. And so that's the picture of the world. We have to recognise that Europe, OECD Europe, and China will be challenging the United States and Japan. And of course, Lyndon LaRouche has been talking about the physical economy and the problems in the United States and so on, and in Japan, there it is in numerical terms. Now, the free trade agreements. Somebody's mentioned the free trade agreements. Do we know what we're doing? And we're talking about a free trade agreement with the United States of America. Lyndon LaRouche and others have been talking about the increase in debt in America. Now, this is the data. Now, the whole thing's just going through the roof. And the American economy is being propped up by the creation of free money at 1% interest rate. 1% interest rate. You can borrow anything you like for 1%. It's mad. And so the US dollar is rapidly depreciating. Well now, do we want to get into bed with a country that is managing interest rates at 1% and into a free trade agreement, the US dollar is rapidly depreciating. We could be in dire straits. I think we're buying military security, and we could be selling an awful lot of Australian industry into bankruptcy. Now, China. I showed my wife this business with China, and she said, "You don't worry about it, you don't have to go down to the supermarket." I found out that some of these supermarket chains in Australia, if you go and buy their home brand or their generic fresh frozen carrots, made in China. You can go to some of the confectionery shops and you buy a thing like a paddle pop made in Shanghai. And you go around to the greengrocery part of the supermarket and you pick up the garlic imported from China. So we're doing pretty well in Australia. What on earth do we need to have a free trade agreement with China? So China is already the world's largest producer of cereals. So if China is already the world's largest producer of cereals, why do we have to have a free trade agreement on cereals and things? Meats, fruits, vegetables, rice, cotton, zinc, tin. Leading manufacturer of textiles, footwear, steel, refrigerators. I went with my son through a number of these Chinese factories, and their manufacturing equipment was made in China, very high quality, and churning it out. I'll just mention, driving from Shanghai out to a big industrial city, we went on a freeway. It was about 4 lanes each way in either direction, and down the median strip was beautiful lawns. And then in the middle of the median strip was about 4 or 5 rows of roses in bloom. And it seemed to go for 50 miles. Incredible. The batters, we went through some mountainous parts, and the batters were beautifully prepared and planted out. And the signs on the freeway were in Chinese and English. It didn't look at all like a developing economy. And we got out to this industrial city and these huge industrial estates, and the names, Nokia, Fujitsu, you name it. And a taxi driver said they have 70 of the top 500 manufacturing firms in the world have manufacturing plants in the town. 70 of the top 500 have manufacturing plants in the city that we were visiting. It's big time and developing rapidly. So I'm not too sure if we want to have a free trade agreement with China. And the ASEAN. Do ASEAN want us? We face a danger of becoming an unwanted outsider, even an unwanted competitor. Now, this is ASEAN. I can do the same thing on electricity production in ASEAN. And that's the sort of thing that's happening with ASEAN. They're galloping up through the roof. And here's Australia. Now, there's the year 2000, there's 90. Let's go to 2010. They could easily be about 7 or 8 times the size of Australia. Do we want to enter into a free trade agreement at the moment when they could be developing substantially faster than we are? We have to think about it very carefully. I just wonder if the people that are organising these free trade agreements and their belief in market forces, if they know exactly the impact on Australia. Now, the population of Australia. I'm putting it to you that we have to think about increasing the population. Now, in the 1950s, and that's when I was starting work on the Snowy scheme, for example, in the decade of the 1950s, the population increased by 25%. And that was a time of, if you like, full employment and increasing prosperity, and everybody busy, and we were getting on with building the Snowy scheme and building this and that and the other. Admittedly, it was just after the war, but in the decade of the 1950s, it was a great decade of growth and development in Australia. And I'm saying to you, if we could grow 25% in the decade of the 50s, we could probably grow 25% in the next decade. And I think we ought to think about that. I think the Australian government should have a positive, as I'm pointing out later, a positive program of national development, investment in the national economy. And if we get on with the projects that I want to build, we're going to need that sort of people. In other words, I'm not saying population for population's sake. I'm saying there's work to be done. We're going to need the people to help us get on with the job. And it's a matter of agreeing amongst ourselves that we want to do these things and to develop the nation. So, Australia is facing a different future. We're having growing and powerful neighbours. How can we cope? How should we cope? Should we be growing and powerful too? And I'm suggesting to you we should be growing and powerful, and let's get on with seeing how we're going to do it. Here we are, Western Australia. Now, it was mentioned this morning, in Western Australia, the people of Western Australia probably have more, if you like, potential wealth per head than any other people on earth. The enormous resources of Western Australia are just so huge that the people of Western Australia have the potential to be the richest people on earth. Now, I'm not suggesting you just sell the lot and spend the money. But I get worried when I read some of the policy statements of the Western Australian government. And I was recently up in the Kimberley, in Broome, and up in Port Hedland. And I went around the regional development offices in Broome and in Derby and so on. And it took my breath away. And the point was, there's just a population of 31,000 people up there in the Kimberley, and they've got these various, the Kimberley development thing, and they got the Broome development deal and the Derby thing, and I went into them. And they are carrying on as if they're the only people in the world, and the only way Derby is going to go ahead is by competing with Broome or the Ord. In other words, it's just local, parochial. And the policy statements issued by the Western Australian government appear to assume that each region is competing for its future almost as a separate country. Well, if they've only got 31,000 people, they're not going to do very well. The populations are just so low that it's ridiculous to even think and plan in terms of these people providing the resources and organisation to get on with the job. These are national problems and statewide problems. And the populations are so low that nothing happens, little is done, and no plans are made. And the major problem should be seen as matters of national responsibility. Now, the last thing the Western Australian government wants to hear is the words national responsibility, because that means the feds, and they're the hated enemy. But let's have a look. And I'm going through the potential very quickly. Gold mining. I think the gold industry is headed for a long-awaited and sustained increase in profitability as the price of gold continues to rise. If you're in doubt about your investments, throw it into a few Western Australian gold mines. They could double in price in the next 2 or 3 years. The United States is desperately creating credit at 1%. If they're creating credit at 1%, that increases the value of real assets such as gold. The Americans can't continue to print money without the price of gold rising very rapidly. Okay, Western Australian gold industry, if you got any shekels, put it in. Nickel, I could have had dozens of maps like this. But I'm saying that Western Australia can expect to develop new mines and mineral projects indefinitely. Now, one of the things that drives me mad when I read the local papers and some of these economic development reports and press releases and so on, every new development in Western Australia is treated as a gee whiz thing. And it was made possible by somebody who made a deal with this or gave concessions on that or the other. And I think there's almost a juvenile attitude towards the resources of Western Australia, and you sense there's a government anxious to flog it off or something as quick as possible and to get the next bit going. And I think it is wrong. I feel mineral projects in Western Australia will continue to develop indefinitely. There's more coming and they'll continue to come, and the best thing you can do is to take it calmly and make sure it's done properly. Now, somebody mentioned earlier on about all of the great private railways up here. One of the problems with the private railway system that has been done for these iron ore mines is that the Western Australian government, in effect, agreed with the mining companies that the Western Australian government would not construct any competing common carrier railroads. So the Western Australian government backed out of the field and said, OK, the mining sector can do it. We've already had an argument where somebody else wanted to develop a mine up there in the Newman area, and they had to negotiate with one of the other mining companies to have access to the railroad. Now, I jumped into the argument saying it'd be far better to have a common carrier railroad going right up to the coast, and that would enable access to all these little mines, lots of them. And the Western Australian government has got itself locked into a situation where they're in effect saying that all railroads up in that part of the world are going to be done by the private sector, and if they're done by the mines want to have exclusive use and they don't want anybody else to use it. And I feel there is need for a common railway. And that is something you can do in Western Australia and propose it. I think it would be supported nationally, because as far as I'm concerned, a railroad like that immediately provides access to all of those mines in the northwest, to industrial places in Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide and what have you, and all the factories over there. So the rest of Australia would gain access to, if you like, participate in Western Australian development. And you get the impression that the Western Australian government doesn't want it to happen, because the last thing they want to do is to open the door to the other states, and they're prepared to try and do business with overseas interests. So I think you've got to have some pretty realistic study of the resources of Western Australia and the way you're going to plan the development of Western Australia. And it must be done having regard to the national interest. You can't avoid it. Oil. There's been remarkable growth and it's going to continue. Now, the development of the petroleum resources in Western Australia has been directed to overseas markets, with little attention to the prospects for Australian industries to participate. And participation is hindered by the remoteness of the area, and as all these offshore projects are developed, you find that various manufacturing and what have you is being done in Singapore or in China or something like that, and there is less and less opportunity for Australian industries to participate. I want to have, in the first place, a major road with road suitable for road trains going from that area to that area down there, and that would be good and that would be in the national interest, and I want the federal government to pay for it and build it, even if Western Australia doesn't like it. But you might have to take that attitude, because it's in the national interest to do it. Now, Western Australian exports have been growing, and you see all the Western Australian exports are growing. There are other industries are not doing too well. The primary, other primary and manufacturing is down there. It's the quarry is doing very well, and the rest of it's not doing too good. But I'm saying if we put the road in, and you'll see some other things I'm planning to do, we could lift this game and lift it for all of Australia. Now, water resources. Right through there, the rain comes down in the monsoon season, and all sorts of crops can be grown just in a few months. And if you like, from December through to May, you've got wonderful potential for crops, and the rain just comes out of the sky. Virtually nothing is grown. And the reason for it is there's no access to markets. And I've been up there in the Gulf country chatting to farmers, and they've been showing me the crops that they grow and then just allow to die on the vine because they couldn't get it down to market. And the Queensland government says they've got to take it across there and take it all the way down. But so there is enormous potential, and it doesn't need irrigation and doesn't need great dams or anything else like that. The rain falls out of the sky every monsoon season. There are crops that could be grown, and the important thing is to provide access to the market. And there's surplus water available in runoff. 23% of Australia's national runoff is up in the Kimberley and the northwest, and 23% is up in the Gulf country. And you've got to get, the idea of the magnitude of that. The Murray-Darling Basin is only 6% of Australia's runoff. They've got 23 and 20. So the potential in runoff and the potential in rainfall is truly enormous. And so I want to talk about various engineering projects that I've looked at. These are national water development projects. I'll show you something on the Clarence inland and a little comment on the Snowy. The Ord. The Ord was controversial from the beginning. Now, water supplied to farmland area are about 1/4 of what was originally planned. We really haven't developed the full potential of the Ord River the way it should have been. The project still has enormous potential as a food bowl for overseas markets. And the critical task is to provide the transport facilities. And that includes overseas and others. But I've been looking at markets. What are the logical markets for the Ord? And I've been looking at integrated development. There's the boundary, there's the border between Western Australia and the Northern Territory. And over there we've got the Ord Project and Lake Argyll and so on. Over here, there's even greater potential on the Victoria River and great potential for irrigation here, but that's in the Northern Territory. So nothing's done there, and things have been done for 40 years over there. And the sensible thing is to integrate the lot and make it a national development area. And so we've got to look at the crops. And one of the problems is that the Ord was developed on the basis of what we can call tyranny of distance crops. Can you get this? The concept. Because of the fact they can't get produce to market, they went for sugar. With sugar, it doesn't matter how long you take to get to the market. So sugar was a good crop for the Ord. But things like pumpkins, mangoes and bananas, you've got to get them to the market quickly. And so the Ord was originally developed on the basis of cotton and sugar. Cotton's mostly phased out, and sugar. But the real potential is in the fruit and vegetables. And that's the crane at the port. And so, admittedly, the area under cropping is increasing, and the gross value of irrigation is increasing. But I'm going to show you a potential market for the Ord, which is readily available if we only act. Oh, sorry, how the bloody hell. Okay, I'm bringing in the Fitzroy, Ernie, the Fitzroy. That's enormous potential. I've been up there and had a damn good look at it a few weeks ago. It's important that you have an idea of this tyranny of distance. Geoffrey Blaney had it right, and when he talked about Australia, if you like, developing on a basis of the tyranny of distance, we grew wheat and wool, which are crops that don't require any storage. You see, if 150 years ago, when they had the wool, they could shear the wool one year and sell it a year later in Europe, and that was all right. The price would cover it, it was stored well, and so on. And so Australia developed on the basis of tyranny of distance crops, canned fruit, dried fruit, grains and grazing, wool, but low profit. The real high profit is up here in horticulture and selling to the markets. Now remember what I said earlier, that we're doing this, we're shipping off our cereals, we're doing the grains, canned and dried fruit. The Chinese are sending us fresh frozen carrots because there's high profit. Now, we've got to think about that. And you can see that if we improve the access to market, we increase profits, we raise the value of farm, we raise the benefits of irrigation with increased, better transport, we increase the value of water, and it raises our national prosperity. So we've got to get our goods to market. That's the first thing. So here we are. This is the Australian domestic market. There's the Ord and the Fitzroy. And, oh, bugger me, what was that? There's a market there for 18 million people. So there's the Ord and the Fitzroy, and a market there for 18 million people, and no way of getting the goods to market. And the incredible thing is that in Western Australia, they've got roads now that come down here and go across there and into Broome and down. And so we've got road trains that go from the Ord to Perth, road train, weekly road train and so on. It's almost the same distance from the Ord to a market of 18 million, which is 10 times the size of the market in Perth. So we've got to think about how we get the goods to market. And here's one of my proposals. And the Tammany, if I got the pronunciation right, Tammany Desert Road through there. Tanami, thank you. And I want to put seal that road and make it much wider, take it for road trains down here, down to Broken Hill and into Melbourne and Sydney. So, and I've got a similar project up there. That is readily possible, and it's just if you try and do it at the moment, you get an awful lot of dust. But that would integrate the Ord into these markets here. It should be a national project. There's no way the Western Australian government would propose it, but it is necessary and immediately important for the nation. And there's a road train that does Ord to Perth in a weekly round trip. They could be doing Ord to Melbourne and Sydney in weekly round trips. And that's the sort of thing that I have in mind. And there we are. And of course, if you have the road, you can transport cattle, transport fodder, integrates the grazing industry very well, and minerals. We could use it for carting minerals, the Tammany area and whatever, great resource-rich area. And of course, it brings in, you can use the road trains and the wide roads for bringing industrial goods. And this is the sort of thing you can do from Melbourne and Sydney rather than Singapore. I'm old enough to remember this. And when the Japanese were coming down, my brother was one of the last people in there, and they were lucky to get through the Sunda Straits because the Perth and Houston was sunk and everything else, terrible problems. And they are panicking in Australia. It's interesting to reflect on the Australian Constitution. As soon as the Japanese are getting down here and they're floating along, the Australian premiers waited on the Prime Minister and said that they wanted to have equal access on a state basis to the Defence Forces. They wanted to defend all. Perth wanted its own Army, Air Force and Navy, and Brisbane wanted the same thing. but there was MacArthur there and what have you. And one of the proposals was this Brisbane line. And they said, we'll have to give away the rest of Australia and defend it there. And if you go to Tenterfield there, just south of Brisbane, you can see the trenches and the tank traps. They were building tank traps just south, and I'm damned if I know. The Japanese would be bloody stupid. But anyway, that was it. They were scared stiff and they were prepared to give the country away. Okay, I think we're doing the same thing in a different way. Aboriginal policy. And I see Aboriginal policy as a way of giving the country away. The policy of native title, together with sit-down money, is a human disaster. Terrible, but wicked. It's a policy of exclusion and rejection. The generous sit-down money destroys dignity. It removes the will to live, and that's compensated by grog. The policy is cruel and wicked, and it's obscured by sanctimonious nonsense and legal opportunism. We correct the situation by inclusion of Aboriginals in the national future, by encouraging their participation in the development of their region and providing training and real jobs in place of payment to get lost. Now, the other day I was up in the Fitzroy River pub, which is part owned by the Aboriginal community, and you see them lining up in the morning at 10 a.m. and by about 3 o'clock in the afternoon they're well gone. And I went in and had a chat to them. And when they've had a few beers and what have you, admittedly they're a bit maudlin, but you find out what they really think about things. And I got the impression that we were gradually destroying them. We'd removed the will to live. And it is the most wicked thing we could do to anybody. We've told them, here's your native title, here's your sit-down money, go and get lost. It is totally wrong. And somehow or other, we've got to have a much more inclusive policy, and we want to have people to participate, and to participate in a way where they feel proud of their participation. So, okay, I've been applying my mind to it. And here's native title. Here's the map of native title claims all about the Northern Territory. They're the title claim before the Federal Court. It's a legal honeypot. I remember when I was in Perth about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was giving an address similar to this, and a legal guy came in and talked about native title. And he was talking about all the complications and everything that had to be done. You had to have good lawyers. And I asked a question. I said, this is not solving the problem. We're going to have these same legal battles in 100 years' time. And he said, oh, yes. The legal people were sort of getting ready for the duration. It's a native title is a permanent honeypot. A gravy train. It's absolutely outrageous. So, I want to get them on to a few engineering projects. Several needed new roads for national development traverse Aboriginal regions. The roads can be constructed as national projects with Aboriginals in the workforce. Many Aboriginals drive motor cars. Many tasks involved in road construction are similar to driving a car, such as bulldozers, graders, road rollers, trucks, operating quarries, crushing and screening, sealing the roads. We could employ an awful lot of people on work that needs to be done. Construction camps along the road can be developed as local community centres, with houses, schools and training facilities, workshops. We could make it a positive and constructive thing to lift the game of an entire generation of people that are being rejected at the moment. I am certain that this is a feasible concept. There is strong positive economic benefit to the nation of providing jobs and dignity to a people who are otherwise headed for a life of permanent dependence on social welfare. Bloody amazing. And when you chat to the people and you have a look at them, and then outside this Fitzroy pub, there's a sign that says, "Don't drink and drive because you might drive over somebody." Well, the trouble is that near the pub, there are bodies just lying on the road. And you could easily kill people just by driving your car along. And I was just so angry. I felt it's the worst thing we can do. And I see, as I said, I see native title and sit-down money as evil. Evil. And so I think, in essence, in use. Over 95% of the extractions to date are wasted. Terrifying. You don't want it to happen in WA. And here are the Artesian, here's the Great Artesian Basin. Here are the basins, the Office of the Canning and Car. And so there are possibilities for development of deep groundwaters. And I'm writing a book at the moment on the deep waters of the earth, which is going to be fairly substantial, unfortunately. But here's the decline of the Great Artesian Basin. There are all the non-flowing bores. They've been at it for 100 years, and just like India and China, as the bores dry up, they drill a few more. And that is the flow of water from the Great Artesian Basin reached a maximum in 1917. And it's been going down ever since. And I have the greatest trouble in arguing with the Queensland government. And the incredible thing is this, is I am saying that what they're doing is a national disaster. I managed to get John Howard and other people interested. And the Queensland government said, it is not a national responsibility. Water is a state responsibility. And it really is no business of the feds whether Queensland doing the wrong thing or not. They make the decisions and go to blazes. So we agree to differ. Now, one of the other things in which I'm working on at the moment, because this Great Artesian Basin is a thin, very thin, impervious and thermal blanket, it is actually one of the world's best sites for geothermal energy, because it's a thin blanket in which the heat is, if you like, accumulating underneath that thin thermal blanket. And there is enormous potential for geothermal energy in that area. Now, I've been up in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and the Queensland government don't like me there. As soon as they heard I was planning this dam, they reminded me very firmly that it was a national park. But anyway, I've been looking at the potential there. I originally started to think of these pipelines, but the more I've gone into it, I realise there's enormous potential just immediately adjacent. Great potential for irrigation development up there in northern Queensland. Now, we've heard the word of the environment. And environmental activism has become a religion and a political movement. And it has been my experience that the believers, the environmentalists, are not troubled by truth or logic, because their hearts are pure. All others are judged impure and motivated by vested interests. So you have the greatest difficulty in entering into any sort of a logical argument with the environmental people. You can't go through it step by step and look at what's causing this and what's doing that and the other. You can't get the broad picture. Their minds are made up and they're heading off in that direction. And you end up getting nowhere. As a result, governments are intimidated. There is no common ground, and the media love it. The scientists or engineers who carry professional responsibility don't want to say a word, because if they get involved in the argument, they're impure. So you have the knowledgeable people deliberately standing silent. And this is not good enough for the nation. It leaves the field open for the arrogant leaders of the environmental fashion, and you know who some of them are, and they see the weaknesses and exploit them, and government find the easy way out is to do nothing. So the net result of the environmental controversy, if you like, is that governments have just ground to a halt. They don't want to be involved, they don't want to do anything, they don't want to plan or build. And this is a terrifying state of affairs for a nation. Now, the environmentalists have attacked public infrastructure. And I want to talk to you about the Murray-Darling Basin. They claim that the Snowy scheme should never have been built, even though it's providing low-cost electricity in perpetuity. The Snowy scheme is still going to be generating electricity in 200 years' time. And we had the same problem in Tasmania many years ago when our hydro power stations, which had been 45 years old, they'd reached the end of the repayment period, and it was we owned the hydro power station, and it didn't owe us any money, and we just operated. And the electrical energy was fruit on the sideboard, and we immediately put that in to the electricity system in Tasmania because it was designed and built for low-cost electricity. And the federal government got in touch with us and said we were competing unfairly with New South Wales and Victoria because they depended on thermal power, and they were trying to develop in Victoria, they were trying to develop the Portland smelter based on the brown coal in Victoria. And if the hydro in Tasmania were going to reduce their power charges because the power stations that have been operating for 50 years and been already paid for, that was no good. So in effect, the Fed said we had to pay for it all over again. Now, the same thing happened in the Snowy scheme. The Snowy scheme, years later, was competing unfairly with private power at Loy Yang. And Loy Yang were trying to supply the Portland smelter. And lo and behold, the blessed Snowy, with the low-cost hydropower forever, they were offering electricity at prices, they were offering electricity to the Portland smelter at prices that undercut Loy Yang. The Victorian government hit the roof, and then they complained to the New South Wales government, and the New South Wales government and the treasurers in Victoria and New South Wales got together and created an environmental inquiry. So, and the environmental inquiry onto the Snowy and the release of waters into the Murray-Darling Basin, the environmental inquiry was caused and created by the treasurers of New South Wales and Victoria who were worried about competition from low-cost Snowy hydro. So it says an awful lot for the environmental movement if they bought that argument, but they did. And so the whole thing got ahead. And so let me show you what happens. Now, there's recently been notices in the paper by some environmentalists and others who went down to the mouth of the Snowy River and it was blocked by sand. That was an environmental disaster caused by these engineers and others who have been all their wrong handling of the Murray River. Well, it just so happens I go back to Sturt, and I did my own thing. I wanted to find out what the hell was it like when Sturt got there. And when Sturt got there, it was blocked by sand. So in 1829 and 30, Sturt, what they did was they carried a whaleboat in pieces up over the divide near Sydney. They put it into the river into the upper Murrumbidgee, and they went down the Murrumbidgee into the Murray and then down to the sea. And they got to the sea down there, and they couldn't get the whaleboat out to sea because it was all blocked by sand and quicksands and soft sands, and that was the end of it. So when Sturt explored the Murray River, the mouth was blocked by sand. A month ago, environmentalists were filling the newspapers with claims that the fact that the Murray River has been blocked by sand just recently been opened, had been an environmental disaster and is now being improved. Well, it's stupid. Anyway, so nobody argues. You know, I say this, the newspapers wouldn't be interested. And so here's a shot by dear old Sir Ronald East. He was formerly chairman of the State Rivers, and he is straddling the Murray River in 1923 at Echuca. And it dried up like this in 1929, and Hume Dam and later the Snowy Scheme were deliberately built to ensure that the river did not dry up again. Now the environmentalists are saying the river's full of water and it's dying. Well, here it was, it didn't have any water at all. And so some people now claim that the Murray River is dying when it's now flowing almost full of water being released from Hume Dam and the Yukonbeen. And the whole thing is totally irrational. And there they are. That's in the 1914-15 drought at Echuca, and they got the horses and buggies on the bed of the Murray River. People now say that the Murray River is dying. The Academy is holding a great symposium on water in later this month, and it got a whole host of people trying to prove that the Murray River is dying. And there's Hume, does its job, and stores water and diverts it into the inland. And there's Yukonbeen Dam, and I was involved in the Snowy when this was being designed, and we designed it to continue to operate in a 7-year drought, in the worst 7-year drought in the history of records. And so the water is there to be diverted inland in the time of drought. Now is the time of drought and the Murray River is flowing almost full. And there's Guttiga Dam. So the proposed corporatisation, we've heard a bit about privatisation. It was largely amortised. The benefits of low-cost hydro go forever. But New South Wales and Victoria claim unfair competition with thermal, and they want to refinance the scheme. The people of Australia have already bought and paid for the scheme, and it's had substantial benefits over the last 50 years. Even though the people of Australia already own it, they have to buy it all over again. They want to reduce the electrical output, to reduce competition, reduce inland diversion, which is mad. And they're trying to charge the farmers for their water. And what was worse, they want to lock the arrangements in place for 75 years. That 75 years is interesting. That is 2 generations of thermal power plant. You see, thermal power plant has to be rebuilt every 35 years. Because a thermal power station only lasts for 35 years and you need another one. So that's 2 generations of thermal plants just to make sure that the private owners of the thermal power stations are not inhibited in reinvesting. Because they want the private owners of these coal-fired stations to build new ones, and they won't build new ones if they've got a threat of competition from the Snowy. And blame it all on the environmentalists, and they loved it because they were in the news. So we've got to discuss these things more honestly. Okay. The Clarence River in New South Wales floods every few years. I've got a proposal to divert that salt-free water into the Darling. Can you imagine the wonderful impact of that? You know, they don't want that flood water. We can store the flood waters and divert it down the Darling. The New South Wales government and the new conservationists there have told me that it was totally unacceptable. Anyway, we'll go on to another one. The Murray-Darling. These are some personal views of mine. We can double the volume of output. It requires redesign and rebuilding. And there's potential to correct wetland salinity and to correct river degradation. It requires national planning for the basin as a whole, and it is an absolute muddle because 6 governments are involved. And there it is. When you're thinking about the Ord and the others, the Murray-Darling Basin supports 1.8 million people and has agriculture and manufacturing about $20 billion a year. That could easily be the Ord and the Fitzroy. And I want to have a rail connection through there. So I've got to the end of my talk about infrastructure development. Now let's talk about politics in Australia and what really happens, because this is vital to you. Planning for national development in Australia. Who is responsible? Nobody. Now, everybody thinks about the structure of government in Australia, and they think it's like BHP or Rio Tinto, where you have a board of directors and all the divisions. Nothing like that at all. These people were here first. And they wrote the Constitution to make sure that those people didn't run the show like that. This is what it is. We've got the warring tribes in charge. And that is they are warring tribes. New South Wales and so on. In the Constitution, the states retain powers for state revenues and expenditure, health and education, criminal and company law, water, land transport, farming, mining, manufacturing, energy. This is the reason why the Western Australian government are terribly anxious to keep the feds out of everything, because the Western Australian government, they carry responsibility for farming, manufacturing, energy, land transport. And so there's no way the Western Australian government wants the feds to take any interest in those topics. The feds have got they've got to look after defence. Now, Howard's having a wonderful time at the moment, and he's in the newspapers every day on defence issues. Good publicity, and he's standing alongside George Bush and having his picture taken and all the rest of it. You see, the feds have got constitutional responsibility for defence, and all of this is good for votes. And so external affairs and trade, naturalisation and aliens, immigration. And so these are the matters that are federal responsibilities. So they're running the idea of federal responsibilities. But remember, in the meantime, they are not responsible for mining, manufacturing, land transport, water. And all the national development that I'm talking about involves those. And when they go over state boundaries, they cause troubles. And the Constitution was deliberately written so that the states maintained their responsibility for their ports and their rail systems. And it didn't matter at the time, in fact, it was judged to be of value and of merit, that if Queensland had a 3'6" gauge and New South Wales had 4'8½", that was a good thing. Because New South Wales wouldn't get into Queensland's hair. And it was a good thing that Victoria had 5'2½". And so every state maintained its own port and rail system, and the Constitution was deliberately written, and you can read the words of the Constitution. It was written so that the states were sovereign as far as ports and harbours and their rail systems were concerned. And of course now it's vital also in thinking about national development. This is the way Australia was in, say, 100 years ago. The important thing to remember 100 years ago is that road transport was not invented when the Constitution was written. Our modern systems of communications weren't invented when the Constitution was written. And Australia was not a part of a global economy. We were a separate state economies. So road transport was not invented when the Constitution was written, and we have great difficulty in handling road transport as a, if you like, national road systems. Now, one of the problems has been that the competition between the states has led to differences in their expenditures and the way the states are managed. Western Australia is doing well because Western Australia can earn money from exports and things like that. Western Australia is doing well. But you see, as far as Victoria and New South Wales are concerned, their exports and what have you is going backwards. So there are problems, and they have devised means of coping. And if we look at what's happening, we can define older industrial Australia as New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and newer industrial Australia, Queensland and WA and the NT. And what's happening is that the population is increasing, The gross domestic product, state product is increasing, electricity consumption is increasing. In other words, in the system in Australia, there is this, if you like, movement of population towards WA and movement of industry and so on. And these other states have problems. And so they've devised some interesting techniques of coping with that. And so this is what they've done. Much less public investment in infrastructure, larger allocations for social welfare, deficit in budgets, sale of public assets. Now I'll explain to you, you see, if they sell off the public assets, that's revenue without taxation. And to balance the books, introduction of native title. I see native title as a device to privatise Aboriginal welfare, and it hasn't worked. Sale of gold reserves, expansion in the service, encouragement of gambling as a tax reserve. You know, have you seen that casino we got in Melbourne? Encouragement of sport as an economic activity. The idea that Australia is a post-industrial, and encouragement of mass education. In Victoria, they closed the technical schools. And so this is what's happened. Production, you know, Lyndon LaRouche keeps on talking about the production society. Well, there it is declining and services are going up. Our production and exports are insufficient to pay the bills. We borrow money and we're living, Australia is living beyond its means. And this means that industries, and because one of my sons is in manufacturing and industry and I know these costs, if you look at the service sector, that is in effect an overhead on production. And since the 1950s, it's been steadily increasing. It's gone from about 70% to 400%. And that is the burden that all our manufacturers and exporters have to carry. Every farm, mine and factory carries this impost as they struggle to compete in world markets. So, and here's the public capital expenditure that's declined. So governments have walked away from public capital expenditure and they've gone for greater and greater services. How have they funded it? Creative accounting. The attempt to limit revenue allocations led to the states devising new ways. In Victoria, the Victorian government sold off the street trams and then leased them back. And the feds made a noise and the feds, oh, we're not borrowing overseas, we're just leasing them now and buying them back. You know, selling them now and buying them back. They sold the State Electricity Commission in New South Wales and they got $40 billion without tax. That was immediately a great cash bonanza to the state government. The sale of the water boards. And in the decade of the 90s, Australian governments raised $100 billion without any taxation. They just sold the assets of the people. And so, if you look at the global comparisons, total sales in Australia in billions of dollars, here's Australia and New Zealand, Hungary, Argentina, Malaysia, Brazil, Mexico. We're in good company, but the interesting thing is that we were the best. Australia raised more revenue per head from privatisation in that decade. Australia and New Zealand, we were the grand champions in going off to the cash converters, in just flogging off the assets of the people to the cash converters. We were the grand champions of the world. Can you ever imagine getting that into the newspapers or on the TV? No way. But that's the reality of it. Oh, they'd all talk about market forces. The consequences. It's created an overseas debt borne by all Australians. When Victoria sold off its CEC and the debt was taken up, bought by an American company, that became a debt for all Australia. So the Victorian government just sidestepped this debt. It was borne by the people of Australia. The pension funds that used to invest in, the Border Works bonds and the other bonds and all the rest of it, they got their money back and were told to put it on the stock exchange. That caused the stock market to go up, and the government said, look, what benefits we had. It was a one-off cash gain. And they used the cash gain to fund the services. In Victoria, they said, look at all the schools and hospitals we're supporting. Money raised without taxation. And the flow of overseas funds led to increases in share values, property values, executive salaries. And, you look at the prices of houses in Sydney and Melbourne. Whole suburbs of $1 million houses. And it's absolutely scandalous. And it's been helped by this business of sale of public assets. Okay. The consequences. The concept of separate and competing state economies is locked into the Constitution, but we're fighting for our lives on a national, in a global context. Let's talk about the Constitutional Convention. We then had a Constitutional Convention. And one of the incredible things about the Constitutional Convention is that both major parties agreed that the Constitution was not going to be discussed at the Constitutional Convention. No, just get the message. Both major parties agreed that the Constitution was not to be discussed at the Constitutional Convention. The only item was head of state. And both major parties were also totally opposed to the election of a head of state. Now, the reason for this is simple. Remember those charts of the organised management structure, the organisation structure thing, with the Australian government at the top and the states underneath and then the warring tribes. If we had an elected president, that elected president would be the only person in Australia with a mandate to look at the totality of it all, to look at the federal, the national government and the states. An elected president would be the only man with constitutional authority to look at the totality of Australia. And there is no way the premiers wanted that, and there's no way the government wanted that, and the Liberal Party and the Labor Party didn't want it. So the Liberal Party and the Labor Party have got themselves locked into a position where they are desperately trying to retain the present constitution and are totally opposed to any elected president. Now, we're going to have diabolical strife if Queen Elizabeth drops dead. Because nobody wants to say, God save King Charles. and the trouble is, and this would really throw, some recalcitrant state like South Australia or Tasmania would say, God save King Charles, and that'd create an even worse problem. So the critical issue is national economic management. So here we are. We're on the final, this is the cadenza. This is what we want to do. Get on with the job of developing the nation. Here's a series of policy proposals for the Citizens Electoral Council. Think about national company laws and business regulations. There's no reason for every state to have their own company laws. National occupation, health and safety laws and regulations. One of my sons is up to his, if you do work in a couple of states, you have these problems. National criminal code. We've certainly, a recent episode in Queensland suggests that we might be better if we had a national criminal code. Created a Department of National Development for overall planning and initiation of national projects. They're quite reasonable things. Energy, national electricity regulations and natural gas and oil. Return the Snowy Scheme to the nation. Plan for energy security and create a national energy authority. You see, one of the amazing things they've done is that by the states trying to privatise their electricity system, it's up to market forces, But the federal government can't get involved in market forces except via the Fels's outfit. Anyway. So they've got problems. We've got free-ranging private electricity organisations in Australia, and they're not too sure how the future's going to develop. Water. Water is a muddle. We have to plan for that. We have to think about new water projects, and we have to create a new independent public authority, particularly for the Murray-Darling Basin and the Great Artesian Basin. At the moment, they've got states involved, and they're fighting like cat and dog, and the whole thing is a muddle. And the point is that nobody has the authority to appoint any group of people to actually think about it and do the job. Road transport. You've seen my views on road transport. We need some national roads and building development roads. Rail transport. You may recognise the little picture. But you see, these things can be developed in the private sector if they're planned and built, and if the structure is set up. This route through here could be very economic. When you look at all of the projects and all of the potential in that area, a common carrier railroad is a very rational thing to do. And create a national construction authority. And I don't want a great bureaucracy. You know, when we were working on the Snowy scheme and so on, we were a small team of dedicated, capable professionals. That's all you need. You need people who have the authority to get on with the job, and they have the best expertise. I can remember, 40 and 50 years ago, where the senior public servants were expected to be the best in the world in their field. If you were involved in irrigation or electricity or water supply, you were expected to be operating at world's best practice, and you got a kick in the bum if you didn't. I was with the hydro in Tasmania. I was going overseas every 2 years, sort of thing. They say that we were not, operating according to market forces. We were competing with Ontario Hydro and Quebec Hydro and all the rest of it. We were trying to attract industries to Tasmania. We watched their prices like a hawk. We knew exactly the prices of all our world competitors, and we organised ourselves, and we got a reputation for advanced engineering, the best in the world in some of the things we're doing. We were first in the world with machine tunnelling and things like that. Absolutely wonderful. But we were a government organisation where the top management expected the young engineers to be operating world's best practice. And no excuses. You just got on with the job. And if you wanted to go overseas, you did so and you're off where you went. You were expected to be on top. We don't do that these days. And national pioneer teams. I want to create pioneer teams. I've been talking about this for the Aboriginals, but there's an awful lot of young people. And somehow or other, we have to think about how we're going to put young people to work. And I mentioned in Victoria, we shut down the technical schools. Now, as a boy, I went to a technical school. I was a junior tech kid, and I loved it. And we learned woodwork and blacksmithing and turning and fitting and how to fix motor cars. And it was by the way, my tech school was a competitive entry tech school. I topped the entrance exam. But the point was that we did the best of mathematics and physics and chemistry, as well as doing these practical hands-on things. The staff were all male, and it was a male operation. About 30 years ago in Victoria, with the feminist movement, they started to close down the technical schools because they said they were exclusively male. And all the kids had to go away to the high schools. And what was worse is that the high schools gradually developed where virtually all of the teachers, 80% of the teachers were female. And that's the case in high schools in Victoria. So we've created a situation where the kids, the teenage boys, have no outlet. they go along to high schools where the curricula has been feminised, the sorts of subjects, the things they're taught and everything else. No, it's not, shall I say, politically correct for people to talk like this, but I've got a licence. My wife is convener of an international committee on the status of women, and she has to fly to New York and Geneva every year and chair these meetings, and she's in touch with ladies all around the world who are on her committee. Her greatest problem is Western feminism. And Western feminism is causing an awful lot of headaches for her and problems in places like Africa and the Muslim countries and in South America and what have you, and China, India. And the difficulty is that Western feminism, the Germaine Greer's sort of thing, have created an atmosphere of gender warfare. We have courses in the universities around Australia on women's studies. And if you look at these courses on women's studies, they are courses in gender warfare. And my wife is saying, this is utterly wrong. What we have to do is to recognise that men and women are different, they have different roles in life, and the only way forward is in harmony. And the people who are on this gender warfare, there are equal rights, equal that, you know, and the whole thing has created enormous problems. And one of the problems is these teenage kids, boys, who are turned off and are angry with the system, and we don't give them any opportunity to develop in life. And I'm saying I want to get on with that job, and I want to make sure I can grab some of these kids and at least give them an opportunity to see what they can do, get them out of this terrible problem in the cities where they get social welfare, they have motor cars, and they just do enormous damage. And the aggression and hatred amongst them is terrifying. We can't allow it to continue. And, okay. Thank you.